I had taught endurance theory for 37 cycles, long enough to know exactly when a room stopped listening and started memorizing. That moment always came when the graphs appeared. Clean curves, color-coded failure thresholds, neat vertical lines labeled system collapse. Students respected those lines. They feared them. They understood that crossing them was not bravery, but stupidity. Biology was not impressed by courage. Muscles tore. Organs failed. Neural pathways overloaded. Endurance was not a virtue. It was a measurable, finite resource, and once spent, the body simply stopped. The lecture hall was quiet as the data scrolled across the air between us. Species averages, recovery windows, oxygen debt tolerances, heat saturation limits. I watched the cadets track the numbers with various signs of discomfort. The fluorines shifted uneasily when circulatory strain was mentioned. The critoids stiffened at neural overload projections. Even the heavier bone species paid attention when cellular failure curves appeared. Everyone had a limit. That was the point. The galaxy ran on that understanding. Training programs, rescue doctrine, evacuation timing. Entire civilizations were built around knowing when to stop. Endurance, I said, pacing slowly across the platform, is not infinite. It is not negotiable. You do not defeat it. You do not overcome it. You manage it until your body tells you that you are done. I paused, letting the words settle. I had learned that silence was as important as information. Silence made the truth feel heavier. When your systems approach critical thresholds, you disengage. You retreat. You survive. Any doctrine that tells you otherwise is lying to you. Several cadets nodded. Good. Understanding was setting in. I gestured, and the display shifted to historical examples. Training accidents, failed extractions, heroic last stands that ended in body bags. Not to frighten them, but to ground them. Endurance myths killed people. I had buried students who believed pain was something to push through instead of something to listen to. This is why we train discipline, I continued. Not recklessness, not bravado. You will feel capable right up until you are not. And by then, it is already too late. That was when the human raised their hand. I noticed it immediately because humans were still rare here, and because they always moved slightly differently. More stillness, more tension held under control. The human in the third row did not look confused or defiant. If anything, they looked engaged, focused in a way I had come to associate with predators calculating distance. Yes, I said, already preparing to correct a misunderstanding. The human stood, as protocol required. Their posture was straight despite the long session. Their vitals on the shared monitor were unremarkable, slightly elevated heart rate, mild fatigue indicators, nothing concerning. Instructor, they said calmly, I understand the failure thresholds. Good, I thought. Then, but how long do we have? The room shifted. Not audibly, not visibly, but the atmosphere changed, the way it does when something subtly wrong has been said and no one can immediately explain why it feels wrong. Several cadets turned to look at the human. A few glanced back at the charts, as if the answer should be there. How long? I repeated slowly. Before what? Before collapse, the human replied. Once we cross the red line. I frowned. You don't cross the red line. That is the point. The human nodded. I know. Hypothetically. If you had to. That was not how endurance theory worked. Hypotheticals like that were useless. Dangerous, even. There is no meaningful time window past systemic failure, I said firmly. Once you exceed tolerance, you lose function. The human considered that, head tilted slightly. Immediately, I felt irritation flicker through me. Effectively. How effectively they pressed. Seconds. Minutes. A low murmur rippled through the room. This was not insubordination. It was something else, an attempt to quantify something we taught as absolute. Why are you asking this? I demanded. The human hesitated, just briefly, then answered honestly. Because if we know how long we can still function, they said, we can plan what to do with that time. I stared at them. Around us, the graphs still glowed, perfect and certain. The limits were clear. The science was sound. And yet, for the first time in decades, I felt an unfamiliar unease. Because the human had not asked whether endurance could be exceeded. They had assumed it already would be. And they were simply asking how to spend what came next. I dismissed the question at first. Not aloud, not publicly, but internally, with the quiet confidence of someone who has taught the same truths long enough to mistake familiarity for invincibility. Humans were new to the academy. Curiosity was expected. Misaligned framing happened all the time when species brought their homeworld instincts into shared doctrine. My task was not to indulge it, but to correct it. Endurance, I said, forcing my voice back into its measured cadence, is not a resource you budget. It is a boundary you respect. I adjusted the display, replacing the earlier graphs with something more absolute. Failure cascades, organ shutdown sequences, neural desynchronization timelines. This was the part of the lecture designed to end arguments. Across all known sentient biology, I continued, the pattern is consistent. Stress accumulates. Compensation mechanisms activate. When those mechanisms fail, systems collapse rapidly. There is no meaningful window for decision-making beyond that point. I paused, letting my gaze sweep the hall. Most cadets were watching again, attention recaptured. Good. Pain is an early warning. Fatigue is a safeguard. Loss of coordination is a final alarm. These are not obstacles to overcome. They are instructions. The human sat back down, hands folded, listening. That unsettled me more than if they had argued. They weren't defiant. They were evaluating. I advanced the lecture. Consider oxygen deprivation, I said. Once blood oxygen saturation drops below survivable thresholds, cognition degrades within seconds. Reaction time collapses. Decision-making becomes unreliable. At a certain point, consciousness itself becomes intermittent. The display showed simulations, species after species, lines dropping sharply to zero. This is why we train extraction timing so aggressively. You do not wait until collapse. You leave while you still can. A Krytoian cadet raised a manipulator. Instructor, are there any recorded exceptions? No, I said without hesitation. Outliers exist in tolerance ranges, but not an outcome. Collapse is collapse. I believe that. I had always believed that. The lecture moved on to muscular endurance. Microtears, lactic accumulation, energy depletion. I explained how strength degraded long before catastrophic injury, how bodies imposed weakness as a protective response. When your limbs feel heavy, I said, that is not failure. That is your biology preventing permanent damage. I glanced, unbidden, toward the human again. They were taking notes, not frantic, not exhaustive, but selective. Numbers, timestamps, threshold markers, as if they were mapping something. This is universal, I emphasized. These limits apply regardless of training, regardless of mindset. Willpower does not reinforce tendons. Determination does not oxygenate blood. That line usually got a reaction. It didn't. Instead, the human raised their hand again. I felt a ripple of tension through the room before I even acknowledged it. Yes, I said, more sharply than before. You mentioned degradation before collapse, the human said. Reduced efficiency, slower response, impaired coordination. Yes, I replied. That is standard. But not zero, they said quietly. The silence that followed was heavier this time. Not zero, I conceded, but functionally irrelevant. The human tilted their head. Irrelevant to survival, or irrelevant to task completion? I closed my mandibles, then realized I didn't have mandibles and corrected myself by clenching my jaw. To both, I said. The human nodded, accepting the answer on its surface. But their eyes told a different story. They weren't convinced. They weren't defying me. They were comparing. Instructor, another cadet interjected quickly, sensing the tension. Isn't it true that some species have emergency overrides? Adrenal analogs? Crisis responses? Yes, I said, grateful for the redirection. Short-term enhancements exist. They trade long-term damage for immediate performance. But even those are tightly limited. They buy seconds, perhaps minutes. The human stylus paused. Seconds. Minutes. I finished the lecture on doctrine. On why rescue protocols are conservative. On why heroes die young. On why knowing when to stop saves more lives than courage ever will. When the session ended, the cadets filed out quietly. The usual murmurs, the usual relief. The human lingered. As I powered down the display, they approached the platform. Not aggressively, not disrespectfully. Instructor, they said. Yes. Thank you for explaining the limits. That is my job. They hesitated, then added. Next session, will we be testing them? I studied the human for a long moment. Yes, I said finally. Within safe margins. They smiled. Not broadly, not happily, but like someone who had just received a starting time. And as they turned to leave, a thought I did not like settled uncomfortably in my mind. I had spent my career teaching when to stop. The human was learning how long stopping could be delayed, and I was no longer certain those were the same lesson. The testing hall was designed to remove ambiguity. That was its purpose. No symbolism, no drama, just numbers, sensors, and outcomes. Every endurance trial conducted within these walls fed directly into the Academy's predictive models. The equipment did not care about pride or reputation. It measured strain, output, degradation, and failure with impartial precision. I trusted this room more than I trusted instinct. The cadets assembled along the perimeter, fitted with monitoring bands and neural tracers. The exercise was simple, sustained load under controlled conditions. Not a competition, not a challenge, a demonstration of limits. Each participant would apply constant physical exertion against calibrated resistance until their systems reached predefined disengagement thresholds. At that point, the system would cut power and the cadet would be removed. No one pushed past the red line here. No one ever had. Remember, I said, my voice amplified evenly across the chamber. This is not about endurance as a virtue. This is about recognition. You stop when the indicators tell you to stop. Acknowledgements rippled through the group. The human stood among them, expression neutral. Their vitals were already visible on my display. Baseline stable, stress response muted. Humans always read strangely on monitors. Their physiological noise was higher, their margins less tidy. But the models accounted for that. Or so we believed. The trial began. Resistance engaged with a low mechanical hum. Muscle strained. Breathing patterns shifted. Heat signatures climbed. Within minutes, the room filled with the quiet sounds of effort, controlled exhalations, the faint scrape of movement against harnesses. The first cadet disengaged at exactly the predicted mark. Then another, and another. Each withdrawal was clean. Systems approaching strain limits, safety protocols engaging automatically. The models held. Order was preserved. The human was still going. Not effortlessly. Their respiration had deepened. Sweat darkened the fabric at their collar. Micro-tremors were visible in their forearms. The display flagged rising fatigue and increasing oxygen debt. Nothing alarming. Yet, cadet, I said, watching the numbers creep upward, prepare to disengage. They did not respond immediately. Their eyes were fixed forward, unfocused in a way I recognized. Not confusion, but concentration. Their breathing slowed, not because effort decreased, but because rhythm changed. Small adjustments followed. A shift in stance. A subtle redistribution of load. Efficiency compensations I had only ever seen in field veterans. Cadet, I repeated, sharper this time. Yes, instructor, they replied calmly. You are approaching threshold. I know. Then came the wrong question. How long until forced disengagement? I felt irritation flare. You disengaged before that. Understood, they said. But how long? The system answered before I could. A countdown appeared beside their vitals. 37 seconds until automatic cutoff. I hesitated. This was where doctrine demanded clarity. I should have ordered immediate disengagement. End of discussion. That was the safe choice. The correct choice. But the trial parameters allowed continuation until system override. And something in me, curiosity, perhaps, or unease, stayed my command. 30 seconds, I said. The human nodded once. What followed was not dramatic. No surge of strength. No reckless acceleration. They did not push harder. They endured smarter. Their movements became smaller, more economical. Output dipped slightly, but remained above minimum task requirements. The monitors screamed warnings, fatigue accumulation, coordination decay, but the human adjusted faster than the system anticipated. 10 seconds. I saw the flicker of pain register. Not panic, not fear. Pain, acknowledged and then set aside. 5. Their posture wavered. 3. 2. The system cut power. The human collapsed into the harness as designed, breathing ragged but conscious. Medics moved in immediately, scanners flashing green despite the stress indicators still fading from red. The room was silent. I stared at the data. They had crossed every soft limit we taught. Not catastrophically, not recklessly, deliberately. And for a brief, measurable window, they had remained functional. Not safe. Not optimal. Functional. The human looked up at me from the harness, face pale, but eyes clear. That, they said hoarsely, was the answer I was looking for. I did not respond, because in that moment, standing in a room built on absolutes, I realized the problem was not that the human misunderstood endurance. It was that they understood it too well. They hadn't asked how to avoid failure. They had asked how to use the time after it began. And nothing in our doctrine accounted for that. The medical review should have ended the discussion. By every standard metric, the human had exceeded recommended exertion parameters. Micro damage was evident in muscle fibers. Oxygen debt had pushed into ranges associated with cognitive impairment. Stress hormones remained elevated well past recovery norms. The report concluded, precisely and confidently, that the subject had entered a danger zone incompatible with safe training. And yet, there were no lasting deficits. The human sat on the examination table, wrapped in a thermal sheet, sipping electrolyte solution with steady hands. Their vitals stabilized faster than projected. Neural coherence never dropped below operational minimums. Reaction time, though degraded, remained intact enough for controlled movement. The models did not like that. Neither did I. You understand, I said, reviewing the data pad for the third time, that what you did was not permitted doctrine. Yes, instructor. You deliberately remained active past multiple disengagement advisories. Yes. And you did so knowing the system would forcibly shut you down. Yes. There was no defensiveness in their tone. No bravado. Just confirmation. Explain, I said finally. They considered the request, brow furrowing slightly. I wasn't ignoring the warnings, they said. I was prioritizing. Prioritizing what? Time, they answered simply. I stared at them. Time is not a physiological variable. Not directly, they agreed. But it's the one that matters in the field. I gestured sharply at the data pad. Pain response, oxygen saturation, motor degradation, these matter. They tell me how much time I have left, the human replied. Not whether I should stop. That answer should have alarmed me. Instead, it unsettled me. Instructor, they continued carefully. On my world, we train for conditions where stopping isn't an option. Rescue doesn't arrive on schedule. Evacuation windows close. People get trapped. When that happens, endurance isn't about staying safe. It's about staying useful. Useful until you collapse, I snapped. Exactly, they said. So the question isn't where the line is. It's what you do before you hit it. I closed my eyes for a moment. Across the galaxy, entire emergency doctrines were built on the premise that function ceased at failure. We taught our cadets to retreat early because most species could not afford that final window. Collapse meant death. There was no margin for error. But the human was describing something else. A managed descent. You're telling me, I said slowly, that you trained to operate while impaired. Yes. Knowingly. Yes. Repeatedly. Yes. I looked back at the data. That shortens your lifespan. The human shrugged slightly. Sometimes, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with temperature. You don't see that as unacceptable? I see it as a trade, they replied. One we don't always choose, but one we're prepared to make. Silence settled between us. Finally, I asked the question I had been avoiding. And if the time runs out? The human met my gaze without flinching. Then we hope we used it well. I dismissed them shortly after, citing recovery protocols. They stood carefully, still stiff, still sore, and thanked me for the session. As they left the medical wing, I stared at the updated training metrics scrolling across my display. The system had logged the event as an anomaly, an outlier, something to be corrected, not learned from. But I couldn't stop thinking about that final stretch, the seconds past failure where the human had remained aware, controlled, intentional. We had always taught endurance as a binary state, functioning or not. The human had revealed something in between, a gray space where biology was failing but purpose remained. And that space terrified me, because once you acknowledge it exists, you have to decide whether to teach people how to survive it, or pretend it isn't there at all. The Academy convened an internal review within 24 hours. Officially, it was procedural. Anomalous performance triggered oversight. Training safeguards demanded validation. Unofficially, everyone knew why we were there. A single human cadet had done something small, measurable, and deeply inconvenient. They had not broken a record. They had not displayed overwhelming strength. They had simply remained functional after the point where our models said functionality should cease. That was worse. The room was filled with instructors, medical officers, analysts, and one very uncomfortable human seated at the end of the table. No restraints, no isolation, just observation. They looked tired, but not shaken. I began the briefing. The subject exceeded safe endurance parameters during a controlled trial, I said, projecting the data into the center of the room. Post-event evaluation confirms physiological damage consistent with overexertion, but no catastrophic failure. Murmurs spread. This is not unprecedented, a medical officer said. Short-term override responses exist. Overrides don't explain this, I replied. They degrade cognition. This subject maintained decision-making. The analyst adjusted their display. Their performance curve does not spike. It declines. Gradually. Yes, I said. They managed failure instead of collapsing into it. The human raised a hand slightly. I hesitated, then nodded. I wasn't trying to prove anything, they said. I just answered the question you asked. I did not ask you to exceed limits, I said. No, they agreed. You explained them. Silence followed. One of the senior instructors leaned forward. Cadet, do you understand the risk you took? Yes. And you would do it again? The human paused, just long enough for the question to matter. If the objective required it, they said. I watched the room react. Not with outrage. With calculation. This was the moment things changed. Up until now, endurance limits had been treated as laws of nature. You could not push past them without catastrophic consequence. The human had not disproven the law. They had revealed its tolerance band. Propose a follow-up, the analyst said quietly. Every eye turned to me. I hated that part of myself that didn't immediately refuse. Controlled degradation trials, I said slowly. Not to encourage excess, but to understand it. Reduced efficiency under stress. Decision-making thresholds. Recovery costs. The medical officer bristled. That is dangerous. Yes, I said. But ignorance is worse. The human looked up sharply. You'd let others try this? They asked. No, I replied. Not yet. First, we learn. The session ended with no formal resolution. But by the next cycle, the endurance curriculum had changed. Not publicly, not officially, but subtly. New simulations were added. Models no longer dropped to zero at failure. Instead, they curved downward, tapering into uncertainty. A new concept appeared in the margins of training materials. Degraded function window. It was not advertised. It was not encouraged. But it existed. And once it existed, cadets noticed. Questions began to change. Not, how do we avoid collapse? But what can still be done if we don't? The human did not boast. They did not instruct others. They trained quietly, endured carefully, and recovered slowly. But their presence altered the room. Changed the way instructors phrased warnings. Changed the way cadets listened. Because limits were no longer walls. They were slopes. And everyone could see where they led. I lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling of my quarters, replaying the trial again and again. The final seconds. The measured breathing. The choice not to stop. Not from defiance, but from intent. We had taught generations of cadets how to survive. The human was teaching us how people died saving others. And the worst part was this. I was beginning to understand why that lesson mattered. The next exercise was not designed to test endurance. At least, that is what the paperwork said. Officially, it was a coordination and decision trial under moderate fatigue conditions. Something safe. Something measured. Something that could be aborted at the first sign of trouble. The academy was very careful about appearances after the review. But everyone in that room understood the truth. We were testing the space between warning and failure. The chamber was smaller this time, lined with adaptive obstacles and sensor grids that tracked movement down to the millisecond. The task was simple in concept and brutal in execution. Navigate the course while maintaining a minimum performance standard as fatigue accumulated. No competition, no time pressure, just sustained function. The human volunteered. I did not ask them to. That mattered more than it should have. Proceed at your own pace, I instructed, my voice steady despite the tension threading through the observation deck. Disengage at the first sign of cognitive degradation. Yes, instructor, the human replied. The course activated. At first, it looked unremarkable. The human moved smoothly, efficiently, stepping around obstacles, compensating instinctively, when the floor shifted or resistance changed. Their breathing was controlled. Their posture relaxed. Then the weights engaged. Not suddenly. Gradually. The system increased gravitational load in increments small enough to be barely noticeable, unless you knew what to look for. I did. Shoulders dropped. Steps shortened. Grip tightened. Fatigue set in. The monitors lit up as expected. Muscle strain. Oxygen consumption climbing. Reaction time stretching by fractions of a second. Still well within safe margins. Status? I asked. Functional, the human replied. The course continued. After 10 minutes, the human's movements changed. Not sloppy. Strategic. They stopped avoiding obstacles and started using them. Leaning into walls, redirecting momentum, conserving energy where possible. That was not in the manual. Cadet, I said carefully. Your coordination is degrading. Yes, they said, but my objective completion isn't. The system flagged warning yellow. Another 5 minutes. The human stumbled. Just once. Barely noticeable. Their foot caught on a shifting panel, balance wavered, then corrected. Pain spiked across the monitors. Microinjury, nothing catastrophic. Disengage, a medical officer urged from beside me. I hesitated. The humans steadied themselves and continued. Cadet, I said, firmer now. Your body is telling you to stop. I hear it. They replied, voice strained but clear. I'm just not obeying yet. The warning shifted to red. Heart rate elevated. Oxygen saturation dipping. Neural lag creeping into dangerous territory. This is the line, I said sharply. Step off. The human looked up, actually looked up at the observation deck. How much longer is the course? They asked. 30 meters. I replied before I could stop myself. They nodded. And then they did something that made my hands curl into fists. They slowed down. Not to rest, but to preserve control. Each movement became deliberate. Pain signals flooded their system, and the monitors screamed for shutdown. But the human adjusted pace, posture, breathing, everything, to stay just barely functional. 10 meters. They clipped an obstacle. Harder this time. The impact sent a spike of agony through their shoulder. Their arm hung limp for a heartbeat too long. Enough, I said. Terminate. The human took another step. 5 meters. The system cut power. The floor stabilized. The weights disengaged. The human collapsed forward, catching themselves on one knee, breathing ragged, face pale and slick with sweat. Medics were already moving. I stood frozen. They had not finished the course, but they had reached it. Barely. As the medics worked, stabilizing vitals, assessing damage, I stared at the data replay. The point where any other species would have lost coordination completely. The moment when pain should have overridden intention. Instead, the human had reprioritized. Less strength, less speed, less precision, but enough awareness to keep moving. Enough will to stay upright. The medical officer looked at me, expression tight. They should not have been able to do that. No, I agreed quietly. They shouldn't have. The human was conscious again by the time I approached. Did I pass? They asked hoarsely. I didn't answer immediately. You crossed multiple non-recoverable thresholds, I said. You risked permanent injury. Yes, they replied. But if that course had been a burning corridor, or a collapsing station, or a battlefield, would you rather I stopped? The question hit harder than any data spike. I turned away without answering. Because for the first time since I began teaching endurance theory, I realized something deeply uncomfortable. Sometimes, the body says no. And sometimes, survival demands you keep moving anyway. We had built an entire doctrine around listening to that first voice. The human was teaching us what happened when you chose the second. The human was confined to recovery for 3 days. Not as punishment, as precaution. Microfractures had formed along stress lines in muscle and connective tissue. Inflammation bordered on dangerous. Neural fatigue lingered longer than expected, leaving reaction times inconsistent and sleep irregular. The medical staff cataloged every metric with professional concern and unspoken fascination. I read the reports in silence. What unsettled me was not the damage itself. Damage was expected. What unsettled me was how deliberate it all had been. The human had not ignored the cost. They had accepted it in advance, like a known price paid for a necessary result. When I finally visited, they were sitting upright, one arm supported in a brace, eyes alert despite the exhaustion still etched into their face. You should be resting, I said. I am, they replied. This is resting for me. I did not argue. You understand, I began carefully, that what you demonstrated cannot be standardized. They nodded. I hoped you'd say that. You cannot build doctrine around individuals willing to destroy themselves. Agreed. I frowned. You agree too easily. The human smiled faintly. Because that's not what I'm suggesting. I waited. What I'm suggesting, they continued, is that you teach people what the cost looks like. Not just the limit. The price beyond it. I folded my arms. We already do that. No, they said gently. You teach that it's dangerous. You don't teach how to function while it's happening. The words lingered. Most species, they went on, never train in failure conditions. So when failure happens anyway, and it always does, they panic, freeze, or collapse faster than they need to. You're proposing we normalize impairment, I said. I'm proposing we acknowledge it, they corrected. There's a difference. I left shortly after, unsettled in a way that data could not soothe. That evening, the Academy received a report from a rescue fleet operating near the outer trade routes. A transport had suffered cascading system failures after a micrometeor impact. Atmosphere loss, partial gravity collapse, survivors trapped between sealed sections. Rescue arrived late, too late for most. The analysis concluded that several crew members had remained conscious for minutes after safe operating thresholds had been exceeded. They had attempted repairs, manual overrides, evacuation routing. They failed because they didn't know how long they had. They didn't know what degraded function felt like. They didn't know how to work while breaking. The report circulated quietly. So did the human's name. By the end of the week, new drills appeared in the schedule. They were not labeled endurance tests. They were called continuity exercises. Cadets were asked to complete tasks after simulated injuries, after induced fatigue, after cognitive load penalties, always with clear medical oversight, always with strict abort criteria. But the questions changed. Not, are you okay? But what can you still do? Some cadets failed immediately. Others surprised themselves. A few learned something dangerous and invaluable, that even when strength faded, even when pain roared, even when coordination fractured, there was still a version of themselves that could act. Slower, clumsier, but present. The human did not lead these exercises. They observed. When asked why, they answered simply, everyone's cost is different. I watched from the observation deck as a Florin cadet completed a simple relay task with a simulated limb failure, breath hitching, fear obvious, but moving anyway. I saw a Krytoian adjust their pace under neural lag, choosing awareness over speed. None of them crossed the line the human had, but they approached it and learned where it was. Later, alone in my office, I reviewed the updated doctrine draft. A single paragraph had been added, tucked between safety protocols and abort conditions. In the event of unavoidable system degradation, prioritize controlled continuation over uncontrolled collapse. It was a small change, but it terrified me because it acknowledged a truth we had spent centuries avoiding. That survival was not always clean. That sometimes the difference between life and death was not whether you stayed within your limits, but whether you knew what to do after you passed them. And somewhere in the academy, a human rested in recovery, having paid a price no one asked them to pay. And in doing so, they had taught us how much staying useful could cost. I was no longer sure whether to thank them or fear what we would become once we started teaching others the same lesson. The first real test came without warning. There was no scheduled exercise, no instructor oversight, no carefully calibrated parameters. The alarm cut through the academy at second cycle, sharp and unmistakable, the kind reserved for structural failure. Hull breach in the lower maintenance ring. Automated bulkheads engaged. Evacuation protocols initiated. I was halfway through reviewing continuity performance data when the lights shifted to emergency red. Status. I demanded into my communicator. Partial decompression, station control replied. Section 12. Maintenance crews unaccounted for. Rescue teams en route. ETA 11 minutes. 11 minutes. Most species lost consciousness in under 3 when exposed to rapid pressure loss. I was already moving. The corridor outside was chaos. Cadets clustering, instructors shouting orders, security forming barriers to redirect traffic. And through it all, I saw the human. They were still in recovery, still restricted, still injured, and already heading toward the breach. Cadet, I shouted. Stop. They turned just long enough to meet my gaze. How long? They asked. My throat tightened. 6 minutes, I said. Maybe less. They nodded once and kept running. Security tried to intercept. The human slipped past. Not violently, not recklessly, just faster and more determined than anyone expected. I followed as best I could, my species built for cognition, not sprinting. The pressure gradient hit first. Ears popped. Breath stuttered. Warning lights flashed as environmental systems struggled to compensate. The air tasted thin and sharp. The humans slowed, not because they were failing, but because they were calculating. At the breached section, a maintenance worker lay pinned beneath a collapsed panel. Conscious, panicking, gasping shallowly as oxygen bled into the void. The human knelt, movements already degraded. One arm useless, breathing ragged, pain evident in every line of their body. "You're okay," they told the worker. "We've got time." That was a lie. The alarm screamed louder as structural integrity dipped. I watched from the corridor as the human leveraged their body against the panel, muscles screaming in protest. They didn't lift it, not fully. They shifted it just enough. Enough. The worker was free. Rescue teams arrived seconds later, sealing the breach, flooding the section with atmosphere. Medics swarmed the human as they collapsed, consciousness flickering but not gone. I stood frozen. The monitors later showed what the human already knew. Oxygen deprivation, neural stress, injury compounded on injury. They should have blacked out before reaching the panel. But they hadn't, because they weren't waiting for permission. They were counting. In the aftermath, the academy was silent. No announcements, no commendations, just a quiet recalibration as reports circulated and footage replayed in restricted channels. The question no one asked aloud was the only one that mattered. If the human hadn't gone, would anyone else have? We reviewed the timeline again and again. 11 minutes to rescue. 3 minutes to unconsciousness. 30 seconds of functional movement beyond safe limits. 30 seconds that made the difference. When I visited the medical ward later, the human was unconscious, breathing assisted, vitals stable, but fragile. The doctor looked at me grimly. "They used everything they had left," she said. "And a little they didn't. Will they recover?" "Yes," she said. "Eventually." Eventually. I sat beside the bed longer than necessary, watching the slow rise and fall of their chest. The academy alarms had done what they were designed to do. Warn. But the human had done something else. They had acted in the silence after the warning. In the space where protocols end and choice begins. And I understood then, fully and painfully, what made humans dangerous. Not their strength, not their endurance, but their willingness to spend the last seconds they had left doing something that mattered. And if the galaxy was honest with itself, that was a lesson it was not ready to learn. The Academy never issued a formal statement about the incident. There were no public commendations, no disciplinary actions, no official acknowledgments beyond a brief notation in the internal safety logs. The footage from the maintenance ring was classified, access restricted, discussion discouraged. None of that mattered. Stories do not need authorization to travel. Within days, the question began circulating, not shouted, not debated, but whispered in corridors and study halls, carried between cadets like contraband knowledge. How long do we have? It appeared in training debriefs, disguised as clarifications. In simulation rooms as offhand comments. In medical reviews framed as concern. The phrase spread not because it was dramatic, but because it was useful. Rescue teams asked it when calculating response windows. Engineers muttered it while sealing failing conduits. Security officers thought it before rushing into compromised sections. The Academy's models remained unchanged on the surface. Limits were still limits. Thresholds still read. Doctrine still preached disengagement. But below that surface, something subtle shifted. Endurance charts began including secondary curves, shaded regions labeled degraded operational capacity. Simulations no longer terminated immediately at failure. They continued, measuring what happened when coordination faltered but intent remained. Not to glorify it, to understand it. Instructors adjusted language carefully. "This is where you stop," they would say. Then, after a pause, "If stopping is impossible, this is what happens next." The human returned to class 2 weeks later. They moved slower, one arm still stiff, a faint tremor in their hands when they were tired. Permanent reminders of the price they had paid. No one applauded. No one needed to. Cadets watched them with something quieter than awe. Recognition. During a continuity drill, a Florin cadet froze after simulated limb failure, panic spiraling as the system screamed warnings. The human was nearby, not leading, not intervening, just observing. "You've got time," they said softly. The Florin looked up, breathing ragged. "How much?" The human didn't answer immediately. "Enough," they said. "If you don't waste it." The Florin moved. Later, a Krytoian collapsed under neural lag during a navigation exercise. Instead of disengaging completely, they crawled, slow, deliberate, toward the objective marker, completing the task moments before override. Not safe, not clean, but effective. The medical staff tracked injury rates closely. There was no spike. Recovery times lengthened slightly, but failure rates dropped. Panic incidents decreased. Cadets learned to recognize degradation not as instant defeat, but as a condition to manage. The galaxy noticed. Rescue organizations requested access to the updated training modules. Exploration fleets asked about degraded operation windows. Military planners asked questions they had never asked before. What happens after systems begin to fail? How long does purpose outlast capability? The Academy answered cautiously, but the human's name followed every inquiry. They did not speak publicly, did not lecture, did not advocate. They simply trained. And in doing so, they normalized something the galaxy had feared, that sometimes survival depends not on avoiding failure, but on functioning while it happens. I stood before the council liaison when the first formal inquiry arrived. "Is this a human trait?" they asked. I considered the question. "No," I said slowly. "It's a human habit. They teach themselves not to stop when stopping feels reasonable." The liaison frowned. "That sounds dangerous." "It is," I agreed. "But now," I added, "we know how much danger we've been ignoring." The question spread because it needed to, because it filled a gap between theory and reality, between collapse and death. And once a species learns to ask how long, it can never go back to asking only can we survive? The galaxy had built its safety on boundaries. Humans had taught it to look at what lay beyond them, and there was no unlearning that. The council finalized the review 6 cycles after the alarm. It was not dramatic. No sweeping declarations. No reclassification of human biology or emergency doctrine. Just a quiet amendment appended to hundreds of existing protocols, phrased carefully enough to avoid panic and precise enough to change everything. In circumstances where disengagement is not immediately possible, operational planning must account for degraded function time windows. No mention of humans. None was needed. The Academy incorporated the language without ceremony. New cadets would never know a version of endurance theory that did not include that sentence. To them, it would not feel revolutionary. It would feel obvious. That was how real change always worked. The human graduated at the end of the cycle. There was no honor guard, no medal pinned to their uniform. They walked across the stage with a slight limp and a posture that still favored one side, damage that would never fully disappear. When they received their commission, they smiled, small, tired, genuine. After the ceremony, they found me standing alone near the observation window. "Thank you," they said. "For what?" I asked. "For listening." I watched the Academy grounds below us, cadets moving through drills with precision and caution. Some would cross limits in their careers. Some would not. But all of them now knew what the limits meant. "You didn't change endurance theory," I said. "No," the human agreed. "I just asked a different question. That question will get people hurt." "Yes," they said, "and it will save some of them." I had no rebuttal. Before they left, I asked the one thing that had lingered in my mind since the first lecture. "Why humans?" I said. "Why is your species like this?" They thought about it longer than most answers they gave. "Because on our world," they said finally, "waiting for perfect conditions gets you killed. Storms don't stop. Fires don't pause. Help doesn't always arrive on time. So we learn to act in the gap." "The gap," I repeated. "Between okay and not okay," they said. "Between safe and fatal. That's where we live." They departed the next morning, assigned to a rescue and recovery unit operating near unstable trade corridors. Of course they were. Weeks later, I reviewed a mission report from that unit. Multiple hull breaches, atmosphere loss, crew extraction under fire. One human operator listed as injured but operational for 6 minutes past recommended exposure limits. 6 minutes. 6 minutes during which 3 lives were saved. I closed the report and stared at the darkened display. The galaxy still believed in limits. It always would. But now it also understood something deeper. Endurance was not about how much pain a body could withstand. It was about how a mind chose to spend the time it had left. The human had asked, "How long do we have?" The answer had never been fixed. It had always been a choice. And once you understand that, you can never hear an alarm the same way again.